Good morning. My name is Ada Skiles, and I'm the Associate Director at the Chapin Hall Center for Children at the University of Chicago. On behalf of Chapin Hall, I would like to welcome you to our Child and Family Policy Forum. We would like to thank those of you who are here with us today in person, and those joining us on our live video webcast. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Today's program is entitled Youth Homelessness. What are the challenges for policymakers, practitioners, and researchers? I'm sure you will find our program and the conversation both lively and informative. Moderating our panel of experts is Brian Samuels, the Executive Director of Chapin Hall. Again, thank you very much for being with us today, and I will now turn the program over to Brian, who will introduce our panelists.
Great, thanks, Ada, and good morning, everyone. We are really excited about having this conversation around the challenges for runaway and homeless youth. The U.S. has been at this problem for about the last 4 decades. And through that length of time, we haven't developed a strong understanding of how best to intervene and ultimately whether we're actually intervening effectively. Today, there are 3 programs that are operated by the federal government that provide some subsidies to support community-based efforts to reduce runaway and homelessness. We have the Street Outreach Program funded by the federal government that does outreach particularly for chronically homeless youth. We have the Basic Center Program, which is funding that supports our emergency shelters, and we have transitional living programs that really focus on older youth, again, those who have more challenges and ultimately are transitioning to adulthood. Those are 3 really important programs. We have no idea whether those programs are adequate. And we have little information about their adequacy because we don't actually have a count. We don't know how many young people are runaway and homeless, and therefore we don't know the extent to which the programs we offer are sufficient to reduce their individual experiences of homelessness, as well as we don't have enough information to measure whether we're having a meaningful effect on the overall size. The good news is that we have community-based nonprofit organizations all over the country serving this population, both religious and non-religious, both well-funded and not so well-funded. But every day there are community-based providers that are out there trying to provide the right kind of support to these young people, both to get them off the streets and ultimately moving them either towards reuniting with their family or beginning to develop the skills and competencies they need to succeed. Part of what we'll talk about today is what we know from the research. Much of that research is descriptive in nature. We understand the demographics. We understand where many of the young people came from, where they were at just prior to experiencing homelessness. The research is limited as it relates to effective intervention, what works to successfully move young people through and off of the streets and towards a more predictive environment. And again, as I mentioned, we have a limited understanding of the size and dimension of the population. That's why this is an important discussion. Is we need to recognize what we have in terms of our providers, what we have in terms of the literature, but also this forum is an opportunity to begin a longer conversation about how we build a system that really is representative of and has the capacity to meet the needs of this very vulnerable and somewhat unique population. So we're going to talk some today about the youth experience, talk some about the services that are provided, and talk some about the challenges that these young people face, again, with the ultimate goal of having a conversation that moves us to a better understanding of how we intervene more effectively. We have a great panel, and so for many of you, you know each, and so I'm just going to quickly acknowledge them. Amy Dorsky is a senior researcher here at Chapin Hall. Paul Hammond is the president and CEO of the Night Ministry here in Chicago. And Sherilyn Adams is the executive director of the Larkin Street Youth Services in Oregon. San Francisco. Sorry about that. Sorry. Had a chance to visit her program about 3 years ago, and was blown away at the sophistication and the level of complexity in the way they've had to organize their services to meet the needs of this unique population. So we're going to let Amy kick it off, and then we're going to have a little bit of discussion once the presentations have been completed. If folks have questions, we'll have an opportunity to do some Q&A as well. Amy.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk this morning generally about what we know about youth homelessness, kind of to set the stage for what Paul and Sherilyn will be talking about afterwards. So as Brian mentioned, we know quite a bit about who homeless youth are. We know that it's a very heterogeneous population. Much of what we know comes from a handful of studies that have looked at youth generally in specific localities or regions. And these studies have tended to examine the characteristics of youth. Different studies have yielded different results, often due to differences in methodology, differences in the types of samples that were looked at, differences in the age groups that were studied, and differences in the measures that were used. In terms of demographic characteristics, we know that homeless youth can be found in all different kinds of communities, urban, suburban, and rural, although they are most visible in major cities. There's been mixed evidence regarding the racial and ethnic makeup of the homeless youth population. STEM studies suggest that racial and ethnic minority youth are overrepresented. Other studies have found that homeless youth generally reflect the racial and ethnic composition of the surrounding community. We also know that there are differences in the results of studies depending on whether or not they've looked at youth generally in shelters or youth on the streets. So for example, studies that have focused on youth in shelters generally show that there are equal numbers of males and females, or just that the samples are disproportionately female. Whereas studies that have focused more on street youth tend to find that the youth are disproportionately male. We see similar differences when we look at, for example, the age of homeless youth. Shelter samples tend to find that younger youth, street homeless youth tend to have older samples. We also know quite a bit about pathways into homelessness. Some young people become homeless when they run away from home or are forced to leave home by their parents. Other youth become homeless when they age out of systems such as the child welfare system or juvenile justice system. When homeless youth are interviewed, they often report leaving home for reasons related to family conflict, issues such as parent-child relationships, sexual activity, pregnancy, sexual orientation, school problems, drug and alcohol use are often cited as reasons, as are physical and sexual abuse. We know something about the length of time youth are homeless. Most young people who are homeless actually return home in a fairly short period of time or find an alternative stable living arrangement. That said, even short times homeless put them at high risk. Other youth struggle to achieve some semblance of stability and experience longer periods of homelessness or multiple episodes. Experiences of youth while homeless vary greatly, often depending on where they're staying. For example, youth staying in shelters versus youth living on the streets or squatting in abandoned buildings, or youth who are couch surfing. One of the things that's important to keep in mind, of course, is that young people often move between those different types of settings. We know that some homeless youth, particularly street youth, are often engaged in activities that are illegal. This is often part of a strategy to survive. So, for example, young people engaging in prostitution as a strategy to obtain money or food or a place to stay. We also know that youth are very vulnerable to victimization, both sexual and physical. This is particularly true for youth who are LGBT. And then finally, we don't have a very good understanding of use of services. We don't really understand why. We know that there are barriers to service youth, but don't have a really good understanding of what some of those barriers are and how they can be addressed. And then finally, youth, there's also a lot of variation across youth with respect to risk and protective factors. Much of the focus has been on those risk factors, factors such as having a history of abuse or neglect, physical health problems, mental health problems, behavioral health problems. There's been much less attention until quite recently until protective factors, which would include things like relationships with family or other supportive adults, as well as connections to schools or other institutions in the communities. We also know that certain subpopulations of youth are overrepresented. These include LGBT youth, who may be rejected by their families because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Systems youth, these include youth who have aged out of the child welfare system, youth who have been adopted and whose adoptions have disrupted, or youth leaving the juvenile justice system. And then there's also an overrepresentation of pregnant and parenting youth. As Brian was mentioning, we really don't have a good sense of how many youth experience homelessness. Some of the estimates they have are quite dated. There are wide differences in the numbers you find in the literature, depending on the methodologies that were used and how homeless youth were defined, differences in the age ranges that are used, or specifically the way that homelessness is defined. We've had in the past efforts to count the number of homeless youth. These one-night point-in-time counts that are required by HUD, for example, to count the number of homeless individuals and families in shelters and on the streets. They haven't proven particularly effective for counting homeless youth. Often, young people don't want to be found, or they are staying in places where adults or families are not staying. We have problems with our systems for collecting data on homeless youth. For example, there's at least 3 different federal systems. The Department of Health and Human Services has a system. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has a system. And the Department of Education. They each have systems that collect data on programs serving homeless youth, but none of those data systems talk to one another. That said, there are some promising developments in this area. These include efforts to integrate the Homeless Management Information System run by HUD and the RIMAS system run by the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as a recent Youth Count initiative, which was an effort to count youth in 9 communities across the United States using some very innovative strategies. The other thing that we do know is that efforts to really get an adequate count of the number of homeless youth are really probably going to require data from multiple sources using multiple methods. We know that homeless youth have a variety of diverse needs, much more than stable housing. Although there's unfortunately no comprehensive system of care, as I think both Paul and Cheryl Lim will talk about, services are often fragmented and not sufficient to meet the demand. They're often provided by a patchwork of public and nonprofit agencies at the local level that are often forced to try to cobble together funding from multiple public and private sector sources. As Brian mentioned, we have very little in the way of knowledge about the effectiveness of various interventions because few have been evaluated. Consequently, we don't have a really good sense of what interventions work best with which youth. And in particular, we really have a poor understanding of what interventions work well with some of those subpopulations that I described. Getting more evaluation research is really important if we want to identify and scale up evidence-based practices. We also need more longitudinal research. Much of the research that has been done has been cross-sectional in nature, looking at homeless youth at a point in time. If we want to get a good understanding of their trajectories, we need to follow youth over the long term. As Brian mentioned, there are 3 big federal programs that serve runaway and homeless youth. In your packet, you'll find a description of each of those 3 programs: the Basic Center Program, the Transitional Living Program, which also includes specialized maternity group homes, and the Street Outreach Program. Those programs are all under the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, which was last amended in 2008 and is up for reauthorization in 2014. And I think that presents some interesting opportunities for innovation and for public input into those programs. And then finally, I wanted to mention that there are also some other agencies that have programs for homeless youth. These include HUD, which runs a number of homeless assistance programs, some of which homeless youth might be eligible for. They also have the Family Unification Program, which provides housing to young people who had been in foster care. And then there's the Department of Education, which has the McKinney-Vento program, which promotes educational stability for homeless children and youth. So that concludes my comments, and I'll turn the presentation over to Paul.
Thanks, Amy. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Chapin Hall for putting this on this morning. I'm Paul Hammond. I'm the president and CEO of the Night Ministry here in Chicago. I was charged this morning with giving you a real quick brief overview of the agency and our work with homeless youth, and present more about a macro picture of the national response to homeless youth, and then do a little bit of a critique of what I consider to be some of the challenges are in working with the current federal framework and the federal initiatives around homeless youth. So just real quick, the Night Ministry is, if you're from Chicago, you probably know us. We're kind of an iconic Chicago institution, founded in 1976, always have very much had a focus on working with homeless youth and adults or those who live in poverty. We have a youth outreach team that's on the street 2 nights a week and does a lot of work with youth up in the Lakeview area. We have 52 shelter beds for homeless youth and include aftercare. And we also have a health outreach bus that primarily serves adults who are on the streets, to which we have about 60,000 contacts a year off of that health outreach bus. Again, mostly adults. That's on the street 4 nights a week. We have 6 neighborhoods that we serve. Very heavy emphasis on medical care, linking individuals up for services. And we do a lot of HIV testing and prevention. And a lot of the HIV testing and prevention also goes over into our youth area as well. And the area of working with homeless youth, our shelter beds are only for youth who are not wards of the state. So these are youth who are not involved in the system. Probably should be, and should have been caught by the system had the system functions correctly. Several, should have been involved in the system back when they were 11, 12, 13 years old. But when you have a person from DCFS that comes to you and basically says, we don't want to work with the kid unless we see cigarette burns because we're so overstaffed, what are you supposed to do? So we work only with youth who are not part of the state system, who have literally fallen through the cracks for whatever reason and have no place else to turn to. And all of our services for both adults and youth are basically what I refer to as safety net of last resort services. We also work in a harm reduction environment and a low threshold environment. So individuals who come to us for assistance, it's not a matter of making them fill out a lot of paperwork and standing in line until their name comes up or we got space available. If a youth shows up at our shelter and we have space available, I always say we bring them in, give them a good night's sleep and a hot meal, and then we start asking questions the next day. We don't make them stand at the door and see whether or not they're quote unquote qualified to come in. We have 2 niche populations that we have a reputation for working with at the Night Ministry when it comes to working with homeless youth. The first is parenting and pregnant girls. The Night Ministry has the only beds in the city of Chicago that are reserved for minor girls who are parenting and pregnant and homeless. So if you're underneath the age of 18 and you're a young lady and you've got a child or children and you are pregnant, The Night Ministry is the only agency that you can go to, if you're not a ward of the state, that's going to have a bed reserved, put aside to be able to serve you. We do know that girls who come through, young ladies who come through our parenting and pregnancy program, which we call RAP, Responsibility Parenting and Pregnancy program, we know that their rate of subsequent pregnancy within the next year, the first year of having their first baby, is only 7%. Statewide, that rate of subsequent pregnancy within the first year is 19%. So we've been trying to show that the provision of stable housing and intense resources are a good indicator, hopefully, be able to prevent a second pregnancy within the first year for young homeless girls. We also have a reputation for working with GLBTQ youth. We have always done a great job of working with the GLBTQ population. Our philosophy as a service provider is to be welcoming and affirming of everybody who comes to us without question. It's a part of our openness that was instilled in us by our founder back in 1976. Because if you have an agenda for individuals when they come to work, when they come to you for help, and you have an agenda for them, well, then it's not an opening and affirming relationship. You've got something else in store for them. You need to accept them for who they are in order to be able to provide them with effective services. And for us, that has always extended to the GLBTQ population. We currently operate the Crib, which is a 20-bed emergency overnight homeless youth shelter here in the city of Chicago, primarily funded through the city. It has 20 beds, youth ages 18 to 24, where 70% of the youth who come to us are still on the streets. They're all on the streets, but 70% of them are GLBTQ identified. So it's very much a matter of having to create a welcoming environment where youth feel safe, as well as being able to provide the services that they can receive. For us, a very big part of providing homeless youth services is to also realize that not only are the youth homeless, but they're still adolescents. And if you remember your own time in adolescence, and maybe some of us are still there, it's a really crazy, hectic, bizarre time. So we're dealing with all sorts of stuff, hormones, questioning identity, roles with authority figures, and you add homelessness and on top of that, it really complicates the situation. So we always try to provide our services for homeless youth within the developmental context of them being adolescents. So on the national level, right now, there's a continuum of services for homeless youth, going anywhere from prevention to permanent housing. All of these services, though, are really geared towards making sure that we promote those protective factors that Amy was referring to, permanent and stable housing, a sense of well-being, a sense of permanent connections. Can the youth identify who in the community is their support system, safety and self-sufficiency? So this wide range of services are all geared towards promoting those particular outcomes. Prevention can be anything from work in the schools to working with individual families who are in crisis, to providing respite programs for youth and/or adults that are approaching crisis. And if those don't work and the youth becomes homeless, there's early intervention services, such as basic center programs that Brian referred to, geared towards minors. There are rapid rehousing programs that are now appearing for youth, mainly an adult model. School programs, you have the National Runaway Safe Line that's actually headquartered here in Chicago, the Safe Places movement that comes out of Louisville, Kentucky, and things like maternity group homes. And for longer-term shelter services, there are host homes for individuals, transitional living programs, both congregate living and scattered site living, most of which are geared towards the youth, hopefully being able to assume a lease on their own in the long term. And then permanent housing, whether or not it's with or without support. But all this, again, geared towards promoting those protective factors for youth. And the night ministry, our services really going anywhere from the prevention up to the longer-term shelters. We don't do permanent housing ourselves, but work with a lot of fantastic agencies that do. In response to the federal framework, some of the concerns and limitations that we see with the federal response is that we are still working in an adult world. Our homeless services system is an adult system. We've come a long way in realizing that homeless youth have different needs, but we're still judged upon. The outcomes that are set forth for us are largely still outcomes for adults who are homeless. They don't take into account the fact that a youth who's 16 years old and is homeless can't necessarily go out and get their own apartment. If you reunify them with a family, member, which is usually their only option because they cannot go out and sign their own lease, is a lot of times not considered a success because the adult system only considers housing on their own or with others, but not family members, as a key to success. Very much concerned about a lack of funding for best practices and understanding what those best practices are. We're seeing right now a shift towards an increased prevalence of funding for subpopulations. Right now, there is a growing understanding of GLBTQ homeless youth. But at the same time, and you develop a new subpopulation that's taking the very limited money away from homeless youth in general. So that is a very big concern of ours. And that's not to say that those subpopulations aren't important. Like I said, we've been working with GLBTQ youth for 40 years. But when you've got a very limited amount of money, and all of a sudden there's all these different subpopulations that are popping up, and where do you go about distributing your funds? And just because somebody might necessarily be a GLBTQ youth or provider in the city, does that necessarily make them a good qualified homeless youth provider to that particular subpopulation? Brian mentioned how many youth are homeless. Amy mentioned the McKinney-Vento Act, which has been largely successful and works across a lot of different areas of the federal government. Why can we not replicate the success of that in other areas? And I must say, HHS has known about homeless youth for 40 years and was really on the forefront with the Runaway Homeless Youth Act 40 years ago. But it's amazing to me that despite that foresight, the rest of the world is still catching up to realizing that this is a very important population to be working with. We're very concerned about the lack of resources for homeless youth, but most especially the lack of communities who are willing to accept homeless youth into their neighborhoods. We see this time and time again when you try to develop a shelter or try to develop a drop-in program. Great, fantastic programs have fantastic results, but the neighbors don't want them. So if we're going to be developing a comprehensive program of services for homeless youth, a part of that on a national level has got to be dealing with communities to make them more accepting of the homeless youth. And then also a big concern of ours is the conflicting policies that exist between the state level and the federal level around serving homeless youth. And then also, too, how federal policies impact youth who try to attain permanent housing. We have, for example, a client who has attained stable, supportive housing, long-term housing, but the subsidies on the federal level that support that particular housing program don't allow her to go to college full-time. So if you've got somebody who's trying to lift themselves out of poverty and trying to maintain a safe housing at the same time, the federal policies conflict oftentimes with trying to help the youth attain that self-sufficiency and that sustainability for themselves. The 1 minute mark is up. I could talk forever. As you can tell, I talk very quickly. I'm going to turn it over to Sherilyn.
Good morning, everybody. How are you? I'm your last speaker before we get to start actually talking. So I will try to get through my materials pretty quickly so that we can have a conversation, because I think that's most helpful in learning more about the needs of this population. I'm going to do a little bit about Larkin Street, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what has changed in the world of homeless youth over the past 40 years, and what are some of the policy implications for that. Larkin Street's been around since 1984. We started as a small drop-in center in San Francisco. Over the past 30 years, we've expanded our programs to include a drop-in center and emergency street outreach, and shelters for both youth under the age of 18 and youth over the age of 18, and a number of different housing programs designed to help young people build the skills they need to become self-sufficient when they transition out of our programs. We have lots of different kinds of housing programs, some serving youth that are kind of regular homeless or homeless, others that are targeted towards subpopulations. So programs for LGBTQ youth, programs for youth with more severe mental health issues, programs for foster youth. And our philosophy is both about the need for youth to kind of have immediate practical supports and safety, who are on the streets or at risk for being on the streets. But as important is the capacity to help the young people that we serve build the skills they need to be able to become independent and self-sufficient, right? So that our goal isn't really about interrupting homelessness, it's really about preventing long-term homelessness, and that young people that come into Larkin Street and into many other programs like Larkin Street actually have the same potential and same opportunities as every other young person who's 16 to 24 to be able to successfully transition into adulthood and to have all of their hopes and dreams realized. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's changed in the past since 1970s when the runaway and homeless youth programs were first initiated, and I would say what has not changed, right? We got the internet, we've had a couple of different wars, we've had a couple of different recessions. Life is different, right? Life is more complex, and the lives of young people are more complex. We didn't have HIV in 1970. We now have lived through the HIV epidemic, and in fact, 25% of the new infections every year are among youth, right? So youth ages 18 to 24 are the highest risk for HIV, or very high risk for HIV. The other thing that's changed, I think, is that the world violence for young people is on the rise, right? So we have lots of different kinds of youth. I think it's about 5,000 youth each year die. Over 700,000 young people are victims of violence or seek treatment for violence-related injuries. When we first started the runaway and homeless youth programs, we were really looking at reunification as an option, right? So figuring with brief services for underage youth, we could reunify them quickly with family. It's intended for non-system use. For youth ages 18 to 21, we figured with some services for a period of time, they would again be able to kind of move into self-sufficiency. Now we understand that youth, really, the transition age youth kind of demographic is 18 to 24. We know a lot more about brain development. We know a lot more about adolescent development and how long it really takes young people to be able to kind of fully actualize. And while reunification is still a goal for many of the young people that we serve, many of the young people we serve, at least at Larkin Street and many similar providers, have been a long time away from their families, a long time away from any kind of supports by the time that they get to us, right? So these are not young people who have run away for a week or for a night. These are young people who have been on the streets for a period of time or had enormously disruptive lives for a long period of time. I think that Paul referenced that many of these young people who are not in the system could have or should have been in the system, right? So young people that the child welfare system, for whatever reason, didn't serve or wasn't able to serve. Young people who were in the system for a period of time, returned home, and then ended up homeless. So not a lot of difference between the system youth and the non-system youth that we serve. So the level of need is different. I said a little bit about HIV, right? We have a set of services to provide for youth that are HIV positive. We started those services in the 90s. Those services continue to be important for young people. The young people that we serve, and I'm sure it's true for all the runaway and homeless youth providers, have very disruptive educational experiences, right? So I think the average kind of reading level for folks that enter into Larkin Street somewhere around 8th grade, right? About 75% of the young people nationally between 18 and 24 have a high school diploma or a GED. Less than 50% of the young people that we see at Larkin Street have a high school diploma or GED. There's a change in the workforce. The labor market is much more highly skilled, right? So to get into jobs, to be able to be competitive in the labor market, you need to have much stronger workforce development skills, and you need to have a higher degree of education. No surprise that the gap between kind of what you can earn with a high school diploma and what you can earn, your earnings over time with a college degree or post-college degree, graduate degree, obviously huge difference in income and income potential. I think that the unemployment rate for youth was at the highest in 2010, somewhere at around 27% for youth in the 16 to 24, 18 to 24 year age range. That has dropped a little bit with a slight improvement in the economy, but not significantly. And I think the other, what we certainly see in the lives of young people that we serve at Larkin Street is much more pronounced mental health and substance abuse at entry. We have always worked with youth in a harm reduction model. We have always had a low threshold to entry into our programs, whether that's our street outreach programs or our shelter or our housing. And youth are continuously, I think, presenting with higher levels of need. And because of a lot of the kind of service reductions that happened over the past several years because of the economy, there are much fewer community supports for young people, I think, across multiple domains. So this has a little bit been alluded to in some of the kind of what are the challenges or funding challenges in serving runaway and homeless youth populations. If you think about the, our HYA is the only funding source really dedicated to serving runaway and homeless youth. Those funding levels, so a lot has changed in the past 40 years, but not the funding levels. So a transitional living program grant is still about $200,000 a year to really provide 24/7 care to young people. It's at minimum, in a very conservative cost structure, about $600,000 a year. So in order to do that well, we need to braid funding, we need to pull together kind of multiple resources to do that. And that, I think, is actually correct. I don't think that any single source should be your absolute total funding stream. But what that comes with, given the kind of differences in regulations and differences in requirements and differences in what folks are tracking and what they care about and what system you're kind of leading into, it's a whole lot of kind of extra work on the part of the organization to just manage that, as opposed to having, I think, a more consistent, streamlined funding mix that would allow you to really focus on the development and execution of services to help young people thrive. I think the other thing is, while we don't know very much about the numbers of homeless youth, the point-in-time count in 2013, with all of its limitations around youth, did identify close to 200,000 young people who are homeless. That's up against a total of about 4,000 transitional living beds that might be available in the US today. So even if we take not super great data on the numbers, we know that there's a pretty big gap between what the need is and what funding streams are available. Sorry about that. I think other changes, other kinds of funding challenges, some of these have already been referenced, have to do with, again, just the need for more for funding that allows for the kinds of services, comprehensive services that young people need. I think young people have been deprioritized or will be deprioritized in certain funding streams. So Ryan White used to have us, which is funding for youth that are HIV positive on prevention and care. That funding stream was eliminated for youth so a couple of years ago. So there are no more youth-specific funding streams at a time when HIV is actually most prevalent against youth. HIV are most prevalent for youth. We're also divesting in the need for, I think, in workforce development programs, right? So we, as new authorization, would eliminate the targeted funding for youth. Now, WE is not a super great funding source for homeless youth who need workforce development, but in the absence of any funding that addresses the comprehensive sets of needs for young people, which includes housing, education, and employment, and mental health and substance abuse support, and the development of independent living skills, then what's happening is that a lot of young people are coming into programs and not being able to get all of the services that they need. And unless or until we develop a better set of ways to measure outcomes that we're looking for, to understand the outcomes, the goal is self-sufficiency, and we know which programs are doing that effectively, then we're not able to fully invest appropriately across braiding different kinds of funding streams to maximize effectiveness. And that's what we're trying to do, right? The goal is that young people get what they need so that they become self-sufficient. The current strategies are all developed based on the needs of adults, not the needs of young people. So my time's up, but I'm done. Thanks very much.
So I think we have covered the formal comments of the forum, and now is really an opportunity to have a dialogue around the issues that were raised here or to raise issues that weren't raised but that you think are an important aspect of understanding the challenges as well as thinking about the solutions. You know, I think one of the important things to remember is as difficult as it is to build programs and to do this work, when you look at the proportion of the budget that these folks raise every year in order to provide services, you can't help but have hope. Because the vast majority of runaway and homeless youth programs that receive federal funding raise most of their funding locally. As indicated, the basic center programs and the others, while they're an important foundation, they don't represent the sum total of the work that it takes to really provide the right set of services. And so every day there are homeless youth programs out there raising the money that's necessary to deliver services that are desperately needed. So there is, in all of these challenges, a beacon of hope, and that's the real commitment that private providers have to meeting the needs of this very, very, very vulnerable population. So with that, we would love to take some questions. We have a microphone. If you could stand and.
Thanks. I'm Mike Seelig. I'm with Chicago Public Schools. I'm relatively new to CPS, and as I've been exploring this work, one of the things that I find frustrating is that I feel sometimes like I have to be in a conversation with the Sopranos to figure out where I would get a resource. So I know a guy who knows where there's a shelter or there's a bed. So where my head goes to is how, what is the system that's in place to, I feel like it's a very 20th century mentality that we think of providing resources as finding the person who has the answer rather than building a system where anybody can find the answer. Sure. And I want to just get some feedback on that because this is very much at the forefront of my thinking and work.
Sure. So I think I'll let Paul take the first stab at it, but to make one point first, which is today we don't actually have a system. We have a network of programs. And that distinction is important when we think about the data you need to make good decisions and the resources you need to support the most coherent use of limited resources. So we'll let Paul talk about the network of programs that are available here in Chicago.
Oh, thanks, Brian. Yes, and I think you're absolutely right, and I love the distinction between having the network and truly a system in place, and there really is no system. There are providers on each side of town, but very much we work in I'm going to admit it, we work very much in a siloed atmosphere. A lot of that sometimes it's because of competition for the dollars, which I think is sad in itself. But there are places you can go to get lists of resources, if that's even helpful. We have the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, which does a fantastic job. There's the Chicago CONTINUUM, our CONTINUUM entity, which is the Chicago Alliance to End Homelessness, are all really great resources. When it comes to minors, there is the CCBYS system here in Chicago, here in Illinois, which as a system that is oftentimes, the requirements for that are oftentimes in conflict with the federal system. So it's a big downfall of working with homeless youth here in Illinois. So there are definitely the resources out there, but is there really, to my knowledge, one area where you can go to say, here's what's happening? There isn't. The city of Chicago is now starting to go towards a centralized intake and referral system for homeless youth, which will be absolutely fantastic when it gets up and be fully running. I think the mayor has appointed some very smart people to some critical positions, and they're starting to take these long-term views on things. But we're not there yet, but I think that there are pieces that are starting to go into place now.
Sherilyn, do you want to talk about what the system looks like in San Francisco?
What our network of programs looks like. It's a little bit validating to know that hear that it exists everywhere, I guess. I think it's a huge challenge across multiple different kinds of systems or lack of systems. That it often is, a guy, or I heard there's a bed, and how do you do that? In San Francisco, we established there was a task force a number of years ago to look at the needs of disconnected youth, and we did establish SFT, which is a kind of a city-funded mini department within one of the city departments in San Francisco to be able to better coordinate services, and they have tried to develop a website where all services for youth 16 to 24 are listed, and providers can try to keep that updated so that at least there's a centralized source that's both youth-friendly, so there's a component for youth, and there's also a provider piece, so you can go in and look for resources, and they've also it's reasonably effective, but it is only as effective as folks keep the information updated. And I agree with you that it makes no sense, given the technology capabilities that we have, that this problem exists in every single community, small or large.
I do know the 40 to None project out of New York with the True Colors Fund. They're working right now on a comprehensive database for GLBTQ youth. That's actually hoping to make a nationwide resource, which again, when it gets up and running, it'll be fantastic. I think they're making some really good headway. But that again is one of those subpopulations. Where are we at with youth who are youth?
One of the potential solutions, and certainly has great promise, which is an effort at the HHS and HUD level to integrate the databases for serving both adult and youth. So today, they operate as two separate systems. And over the last 2 years, HUD and HHS have worked towards developing a common standard for how data is collected and shared. And over the next year or so, HHS will move its programs into the same database approach at the local level. So at least locally, the continuums of care will be able to speak to one another about young people and adults in the same way. Part of the reason why we can do that and we think it will work at the federal level is about half of the youth homeless providers are also adult providers. And so today they operate two separate systems. And with this integration, they'll be able to use one system to track all of their kids, but more importantly, to be able to track all of the services that they use and referrals that they make. And so the real challenge in that integrated system will be to get on board those youth providers who are exclusively youth providers. They don't operate in that adult world, and therefore integrating them into the system doesn't in and of itself represent progress. But the hope is that as they become part of a broader community and build their own understanding of how the system works, they ultimately will be more effective because they can at least benefit from a network of programs and therefore a network of relationships that they may be able to leverage. Other questions? In the back?
Hi, I was wondering if, oh, sure. Kate Buchanan with the Child Care Association. If there's a way to use data from the youth homeless population to help inform child welfare in sort of a cross-system educational way to figure out where the gaps are in intervening with young people earlier on and with their families.
I would hope that there would be highly collaborative work going on in all jurisdictions between child welfare and runaway and homeless youth providers. And I think use of data is one. Obviously, sharing data, looking at the data, understanding the data is one piece of that. I think looking at where young people fall through the cracks, at transition planning, at what kinds of supports are necessary, at looking at kind of why some young people get into the system and why some young people don't, particularly for older adolescents. And I think having programs that are mutually supportive and beneficial of each other in order to ensure that there is a continuum of services or services available to both homeless youth as well as system youth. I think it's, in California, we have some great child welfare reform and great supports at a state level for foster youth. That has caused some concerns around what happens to the homeless youth, right? What has been the We've set up a bit of a bifurcated system so that there is services and supports for youth who are in the system and aging out of the system. There is less supports and attention to youth who were never in the system, or youth who are homeless or runaway, or sometimes juvenile justice youth. So absolutely, I think those systems need to work well together.
I'll also add that recently the Administration for Children and Families awarded 18 grants to communities across the country to look at preventing homelessness among 3 populations of child welfare-involved youth, youth who entered care when they were 14 and older, youth aging out of the system, and then homeless youth who had some prior involvement with the child welfare system. And Illinois actually received one of those grants, and I see some people here in the audience who are going to be involved in the grant, and it's going to involve a lot of looking at data, both homeless youth data and child welfare data. So hopefully we'll make some progress in that, in coming up with better strategies to prevent those young people from becoming homeless.
And I want to proceed with caution here. I think that there is great room for the 2 systems to learn from each other, and they definitely need to be more integrated. I'm highly concerned, though, about what seems to be a large movement towards assuming that what works for child welfare works for unaccompanied older homeless youth. I've seen a lot of that in the last couple of years, that yes, there does need to be this integration, but at the same time, we are talking about a group of youth who have different needs. Child welfare is a huge system. I'm not going to say it's well-funded, but it's better funded than homeless youth. I think there's also a tendency to sometimes develop policy that allows system youth to all of a sudden be working with a homeless youth provider because there's no more money available in a certain system program, for example. So I think that integration, that information is needed. I just want to make sure, as a homeless youth provider who works with unaccompanied homeless youth who are not part of the system, that we don't automatically assume that the system has all the answers for homeless youth, that the child welfare system does, because I don't think it does.
So we have an online question, and the question relates to examples of partnerships between schools and homeless youth programs, and what collaboration looks like for them, or the things that one can accomplish were there greater collaboration between schools and runaway and homeless youth programs. Paul? Sherilyn?
I know from our own experience at the Night Ministry, when we developed our parenting and pregnancy program, we had a very close working relationship with Simpson Academy, which is the high school here in Chicago that does work with pregnant young ladies. That was a fantastic experience for us. I know we have really good collaborative relationships with the different homeless school liaisons who work with our youth from different areas. I think you take a look at some of the communities and school programs that exist throughout the country. They are not necessarily focused on homeless youth, but are excellent examples of that collaborative potential that can exist there. I think what does make the situation a little difficult, and this goes back to the first question, is a lot of homeless youth who are in schools, a lot of them are not unaccompanied. They're still with their family. And there are differences between working with the unaccompanied and those who are still with the family. So it makes the education process for both different types of providers, both the education programs and the service providers, a long one, and that integration is quite difficult sometimes.
So, and I would say that, again, just like a good working relationship with child welfare is important, there's 2, I think, issues that the educational system can help with. One is the kids that are in school, whether they're unaccompanied minors or they are still within families but homeless, to make sure that the educational process for young people isn't disrupted, and that there isn't any, to the best that we can, protect against discrimination or stigma that becomes associated with being in school and not having a regular address. So breaking down those barriers and just ensuring that youth are feeling accepted and supported while in school to stay in school. And then there's all those young people who are not in school. And I think that there needs to be greater collaboration and working together with the homeless youth providers. And where that is successful is when folks can look at those kids who are out of school and far away from credits, right? Far away from graduation. So older youth, far away from graduation. What are the strategies for helping them to get a GED or a high school diploma, and not just to accomplish getting that degree, getting the high school diploma or the GED, but to build the competencies that are necessary in order to be college ready. So what are the career and technical training opportunities? What are the blended learning opportunities? What are the mechanisms by which teachers and educators can inform and work directly with, either through on-site provision of educational services and teaching services to young people? Are there ways to collaborate there? Or ways to set up easy mechanisms for older youth? So I am super concerned about the number of young people that are not college ready and way far away from that, who are runaway and homeless, and who are going to need lots of quick remediation in order to be able to participate in the workforce and participate in post-secondary education. And I would say that relationship needs to be strengthened, and we actually need, as homeless youth providers, to hold ourselves much more accountable for helping young people to make great strides on education and employment while in our services.
And Amy made a great point around most of the research where we have it has focused on risk factors. There's a growing interest in protective factors for the runaway and homeless youth populations. And within that small body of research, you'll find that educational connections are one of the strongest predictors of youth exiting homelessness. So those young people who have an attachment to schools, that's an asset, and we need to find ways to program around and support that. And as Sherilyn indicated, reconnecting young people to their educational opportunities is another way of building the kind of strengths that these young people will need, both in the short term as well as in the long term. So this is not an insignificant challenge, but it has a big payoff if we can do a better job at it.
I'll also add that I think one of the challenges, sort of building on what Sherilyn was saying, is that there's really no dedicated funding to help these young people with post-secondary education. So unlike youth in the foster care system who have education and training vouchers to help them with post-secondary education, there's no targeted funding stream for post-secondary ed for youth who are homeless.
Thank you, guys. My name is Anthony Lindsay. I'm with the Chicago Department of Family and Support Services. And when I attend these policy briefings and I listen to youth speak, one of the most common themes that I hear is around workforce development and financial assistance, money. They always say we need money. I also sit on the Community Relations Council over at the Chicago Job Corps Center. And have anyone ever thought about trying to develop a model similar to what they have at Job Corps, where there's a dedicated site for homeless youth that's willing to go and develop their skill set, obtain their education, get that wraparound service, be in a safe environment that will provide a way for them to develop and learn a skill set so they can become self-sufficient, so they won't continue to depend on the system that's currently at hand and been at hand for over 40 years. Anyone ever thought about that? Because I think that would be a really good, important first step, and also funding for a national summer jobs training program. I think that's very important. We have dedicated programs for summer jobs and summer employment program, but again, that money is very fragmented. It comes and goes, and I think that's very important for us to not continue to want to just feed a child for a day, but to provide them with the skill set so they can feed themselves and their family for a lifetime. Thank you.
Sherilyn, you want to talk some about the work at Larkin Street?
Oh, yeah. I absolutely agree with you wholeheartedly about the need to help folks build skills that they need for self-sufficiency. I think many of my concerns about how we have thus far addressed youth homelessness, particularly with the overlay on how we have developed funding and financing for housing that has to do with a permanent supportive housing model, I think is is problematic, right? Because we are trying to make sure that young people build the skills they need to exit our programs and to live independently. And workforce development is absolutely huge as a part of that. So that is both partnering with programs like Job Corps or other programs that have skills and expertise in helping to develop workforce skills and trades and for young people, right? Absolutely. Larkin Street also has developed its own workforce development program that includes a Get to Work Right Away program. It includes a job readiness class that covers all the soft skills, and we have an internship program that we paid internship opportunities. I think, and we work hard with businesses and places for those internships. We fund and pay for those stipends. And would love for businesses to do more of that. So I think that the primary barrier to that has to do with, and I know, and it's all kind of funding related, right, is that the workforce development funding, whether it's local, state, or federal, continues to primarily target folks who are easy and ready to go to work. Right? So we need to look at comprehensive workforce development solutions that just have a longer ramp, right? It's going to take a year or two for young people to get from like, I've never worked. I've never had a job. I've never gone. I haven't been to a place of business. Like, they go to our financial district. They're like, it's so quiet in these offices, which I feel that way too, right? So they need exposure to business, they need exposure to industry, and then they need skills. And they need a long time to get there, and it has to marry with education. So absolutely, you're right, and absolutely we need to do it. And it's a blended approach, and it requires a comprehensive set of services from start to finish. And we have to be willing to invest. And thus far, we have not been.
I was just thinking, operationally, is the summer jobs program ready and willing and able to work with a youth who doesn't have an ID, who might be new to our program, but yet it takes 3 to 4 weeks to get a state ID? Is the summer jobs program be ready, willing, and able to work with a youth who has no permanent address, who has no family member to be able to sign for them to be able to participate in that program? So I think it's a great idea, but I'm bringing up the example in those questions to show that when you're working with this population, there are certain logistical issues that need to be addressed and concerns that need to be worked with differently when you're working with homeless youth. We have a youth who comes into our shelter for 3 to 4 months, and we spend the first month on getting them an ID. Well, good luck trying to find them even a summer job through a summer federal program without an ID. Is that possible? If it is, great, we need to know about it. But if not, if it's a barrier, then we need to address the barriers. And I think there's a lot of barriers like that that exist, aside from being able to have really good workforce development programs. And we're going to be training youth to be able to compete for jobs at Target when they're still competing with people who've got master's degrees who still can't find jobs after the recession.
So we have another online question. It relates to young people who may participate in your programs and succeed. Are there lessons to be learned from the successes, from the young people who are resilient, that benefit greatly from what you can offer them, that leads to their ultimate stable housing, employment, so on and so forth? So think about who succeeds in your programs and what might we learn from those young people?
I think there's as much to be learned from the people the young people that succeed, and as well as those that really struggle in your programs, right? What do you need to learn from their experiences to modify or change your programs? And I think what that takes is actually an investment on the part of providers to really understand what's working and what's not working in their programs, and to use data to inform those decisions. So we don't just collect compliance level data at Larkin Street. We collect data and information on our services and on how youth are moving through our continuum, and what are the expected kind of outcomes that immediately and kind of medium and long term for young people, and increasingly trying to understand if folks aren't moving along that continuum, right? Aren't moving along that trajectory. How come, right? How come they are? How come they are not? And what does that tell us in terms of decisions that we may need to make, our program modifications? So I'm going to harp a lot on education and employment, but we have had education and employment services for a long time. They were not necessarily getting our young people who are in our housing programs where we wanted them to get. So really took a deep dive, and it's painful, right? It's really painful to learn what you're not doing well and what you thought you were doing well, and you might not be doing well. So really, what are the systems in place to understand what is working and what isn't working, and how are you using that information, both on a youth-by-youth basis, looking at individual caseloads, looking at how clients are progressing, and then in the aggregate, are clients in a particular program doing better than clients in a other program, and what are the reasons for that? Are there more complex issues? Is there a different program strategy that seems to be working better? But that requires tracking data and information. That requires using that information to inform service delivery, and that requires making changes when things aren't working. But that's, I think, the responsibility of providers to do who are receiving funding from individuals and public and private entities to do their work.
I think when I think about some of the youth, our recent youth who've had a great deal of success, I'm going to come back to one of those outcomes I had up on the board before. I think it's that whole sense of permanent connections. It's making them feel permanently connected to other people in their community who are not part of your program, so that they do not become dependent upon the program. Help them to understand what their safety nets are outside of your agency or outside of the systems and the institutions, so that as they do face challenges when they're getting ready to move on from you and after they have moved on, they've got that safety net in place. I think of a particular client of ours who came to us in college and was homeless, and we worked with him extensively and is now teaching in Chicago public schools. And that's because through the process, he was able to develop a lot of really great connections in the community. So I think that is one of those elements that leads to client success, is that sense of permanent connection. Of course, you need to have your stable housing and you need to have the money, but there's the psychosocial aspect of this. And if a client doesn't have that after they leave you, then I think they're more likely to return to you. And although we always love when they come back to say hello, we don't want them to come back and move in with us. Although that sometimes does happen, and I'm glad we're there for them when they need us. But the more you can develop that sense of connection to their community, I think the more you probably increase the likelihood of success. And I'm saying that without any data to back me up whatsoever. We'll get there someday.
We won't let that get in your way. So Amy, could you take a second? You've done work on the Midwest study, which is really looking at young people who aged out of the foster care system from Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois. And some of what you've looked at is the experience of homelessness. Can you tell us some about, does age matter? If you age out at 18, are you more likely to be homeless than if you age out at 21? Or any other observations you might have about the unique challenges of homelessness for kids who are exiting the foster care system?
So what we know from the Midwest study, which, as Brian said, was a longitudinal study that followed young people from when they were in foster care at 17 or 18 years old all the way through age 26. We know from that research that about 37% of the young people experienced at least one night of homelessness after they left the system. One of the things we found was that staying in foster care has somewhat of a protective effect in that as long as you're in the foster care system, you're not homeless. One of the things that was somewhat surprising and I think a little bit discouraging was we found that here in Illinois, where young people routinely do stay in foster care till age 21, was that their rate of homelessness once they did exit the system was pretty much the same as the rate of homelessness among the young people in the other two states, Iowa and Wisconsin, where youth generally leave foster care at age 18. So while it had somewhat of a protective, extending foster care till 21 had somewhat of a protective effect in that the young people were not becoming homeless between ages 18 and 21. Once they did leave the system, they did experience homelessness at the same rate. And what I think this points to is not that extending foster care is a bad idea, but that what states need to really do is think about what they're doing during those 3 years that they extend care from 18 to 21. What different housing strategies, what other services, what other supports do they need to provide to these young people to ensure that when they do eventually leave at 21, that they're not becoming homeless. So I think that keeping them in care for those additional 3 years is a great opportunity for systems to really address some of those risk factors and to build up some of those protective factors so that when they do eventually exit, they're not becoming homeless.
And so then, Amy, you had indicated earlier that that Illinois was awarded a grant. Can you talk a little bit about what Illinois hopes to accomplish through that federal grant?
So I think what we're going to try to accomplish, and there's a number of people here in the audience today who are going to be involved in this process, and we're really just getting off the ground right now, is kind of developing a comprehensive strategy addressing those 3 populations that I mentioned earlier, with services targeted at each of those populations that would really focus on those risk and protective factors to build up those protective factors, to reduce those risk factors. Right now, I think we're really just still in the real development phase. It's not clear exactly what those strategies are going to look like, but it's going to be very much data-driven. I think that'll be a big part of this, is that we're going to use as much of the data that currently exists, both the child welfare data, data from the homeless youth providers. We're going to be doing focus groups with the different populations that we're targeting to develop a really comprehensive strategy.
Great, thanks. Paul and Sherilyn, one of the things I think that goes along with this idea that we don't have a homeless system, we have a network of programs, is it means that the work around homeless youth is typically pretty uniquely city-oriented. It's done within a jurisdiction of city boundaries. And in that circumstance, I would imagine that you have to have a unique relationship with city government in order to be effective. So can you talk a little bit about the work that your programs need to do to work with other city agencies and to piece together a system of support for this population?
Sure. So we are fortunate to work in San Francisco. So San Francisco has a great commitment to providing services to vulnerable populations. Not that it's not without its challenges, but our funding model is we are about a $14 million organization. About 65% of that comes from public sources, and that's a mix of city, state, and federal. And then the rest comes from individuals, foundations, and corporations, all within the San Francisco kind of Bay Area. So I think to be effective, we work closely with city government. We work closely with the Board of Supervisors and the mayor to do the best that we can to inform them about the needs of runaway and homeless youth. So we create policy briefs and we create needs and incidents reports to make sure that the issues around this population, youth as separate from adults, as separate from families, as separate from veterans, what are their specific needs, right? And what kinds of programming is necessary, and how does that fit into the larger ecosystem of providers within the San Francisco community? So we don't need to do it all. We need to work well with our partners in the community, and there are some things that we do very well and need to do kind of as an organization, right? So I think we work hard to play. I'm a big collaborator. I'll go to any meeting. I'll do what I can. So to play well with others within the system of care within San Francisco, to use information and data that we have to inform what needs to happen, and to try to hold kind of the long view about where we're trying to get with young people. And then to, again, understand our role within the ecosystem. And that is, both politics, as we talked earlier, just knowing what that means, that it is political. There is a political environment that you're operating in, and understanding the way that young people can participate in that, can inform and can influence policymakers and decision makers, and to understand kind of how you fit into the larger ecosystem and to leverage those partners and relationships toward a common goal of improving outcomes for young people.
It's a lot of work, especially here in Chicago. I think one of the greatest examples we have of that type of collaboration and success has been the recent development of the overnight emergency youth shelters here in the city of Chicago and the drop-in centers. Back about 5 years ago, the Knight Ministry, as always with the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, worked with an aftercare group for youth who are homeless. It was a youth advocacy group. And through a variety of very serendipitous situations, the mayor became aware that the advocacy group's work, kind of became enamored with them, Mayor Daley did, and then invited them to sit down and talk with him about the needs of homeless youth. And staff can go all the time, but once they hear from the youth themselves, I think it always makes a huge difference. And out of that grew what is today the Homeless Youth Committee here in the city of Chicago, which very much has influenced the ability to which very much resulted in homeless youth now being mentioned in Chicago's plan to end homelessness as one of the 5 priority areas. And again, also too, the mayor working with the Homeless Youth Committee and his folks at the Department of Family Support Services setting aside money for the new emergency shelters and the new drop-in centers. I think that's like the quintessential example of how it can work and should work. But on the other hand, too, you have all these other situations that occur with aldermen who maybe don't want you in their neighborhood, or they do want you in the neighborhood, but they don't want anybody to know that they know that you're in your neighborhood, and relationships with neighbors, and all of that takes full-time jobs within itself. And then you're dealing with, at least in the city of Chicago, the bureaucracy around administering contracts, which takes another full-time position in itself if you're going to do it right and legally. So I'm frustrated here, obviously, but I think that the situation could be better, but we've made great strides. But it does take time and energy, but most importantly, it takes resources, because each time I've got to send a staff member to cover a certain meeting that takes place with an alliance or with another group or with the city, that's that much time that staff member is taken away from their other job. That comes underneath the other duties as assigned. We use that a lot. So it's unfortunate that it does take so much energy and time. It's worth it in the long run, but I wish there was some way we could make it easier so it's not so human resource intensive.
Great. Other questions from the audience? Number of hands on this side.
I got it.
Hi, my name is Dan Harris. I'm with the Illinois Department of Human Services. Thanks, this has been great, very informative. I have a question, I guess more in terms of long-term funding strategies. And my question is about the capacity of the system to measure, or network, or individual providers to measure outcomes. Because if you look at some of the areas that have been successful in garnering additional federal funding, like early learning or some of the maternal child health programs, they've been able to say, we took this at-risk population, we provided these services, and achieved these outcomes. And I'm wondering about your, sort of relative perspective, the capacity of you as individual providers to give that data, or I guess your perspective on the relative value of that practice.
Sherilyn, I'm sitting next to Sherilyn, who's like my data goddess, and Larkin Street Youth Services, but they're doing what we want to do. We want to be like them when we grow up. At the Knight Ministry, we just developed, for the past year and a half ago, our Department of Performance Measurement, because I realize it's something we need to be doing a much better job of, not only to answer the funders, but most importantly to do what Sherilyn had mentioned before, that is to use data tracking and outcomes as a means of continual program improvement. It's got to be a part of our continuous feedback loop on making our programs better for those whom we serve. Yes, I think we should be doing this more. Yes, I want to do it more, but show me the money. Nothing frosts my donut more than a private funder or a public one that comes to you and says, we want data, we want to know what your outcome is, and I say, well, will you fund that for me? And they say, no, we only fund programs. So my response now is, don't demand it of me if you're not willing to fund it. And And I think it's a marvelous thing. Data, we shouldn't be scared of it. It can be our friend. It can be our collaborative partner. And we are now currently working with Teen Living Program and working with Amy on pulling some of our data together to take a look at kind of what kind of commonalities can we understand about the youth whom we serve between our two agencies. And that's been a really good, marvelous experience. And I wish we could do more of that. And that could get us to the point where we can say, here's what we know, and here's the power behind the data, so we can actually start to change the system and start to change funders' minds.
So Amy, can you talk a little bit about the distinction between what one can learn from administrative data generally versus a more targeted evaluation of a particular strategy?
So I think administrative data are useful for measuring certain types of outcomes. But I think if you want a richer understanding and you want to understand why those outcomes were achieved or not achieved, I think that requires more comprehensive data collection, often doing survey data collection, interviews with young people. So I think that the administrative data are useful to look at sort of indicators, but I think if you want to get a clear understanding of what predicts who succeeds and who doesn't succeed, or to understand why certain outcomes are achieved or not achieved, it's going to take a lot more comprehensive set of data, not only also not just looking at the youth, but also getting a comprehensive picture of the program. So doing implementation studies to get a sense of what the services that are being provided, how they're being provided, who's providing them, to get that comprehensive picture. I think that's all really important.
Yeah. Sherilyn, you want to weigh in as the data goddess?
As the data god, wow. I'm actually not the data goddess at our organization. Her name is Dina Wilderson, and she's our chief of research and evaluation. So lucky for me, I've been at Larkin Street 10 years, and my predecessor was deeply committed to kind of using data. And so our data collection, as I said before, started a long time ago. The use of that information and to really look at agency-level outcomes as opposed to program-level outcomes or accomplishments is our current area of focus. And I would say that there are kind of three things that I think need to change in the field in order for all of us to be kind of more outcome-focused and driven. And one is individual providers have to shift their way of thinking, right? And that we have to understand this is an important kind of piece of the work, like Paul has referenced, that he's doing at Night Ministries, and many, many folks are. There also has to be shifts in the funding picture. It is enormously difficult to do that when folks are saying, I'm going to give you, $25,000 and I'm going to fund a program. And I'm like, you're not going to fund a program, you're going to fund a piece of some work that we're doing. So we need to have, I think, funders understand both at the kind of foundation and individual and public level that we need to invest in things that work, and we need to understand and help people develop the systems and the thought process and the strategies for being able to measure that work that they're doing, know that whether or not they're achieving the outcomes, and that requires kind of multi-year, deep investments in organizations. And then we will know what works, and then we can scale that. And that, yes, will mean that there'll be some of us who are currently providing services who maybe shouldn't be providing services. And that may mean that those of us that are providing services will get better at what we're doing. But at the end of the day, if you don't know what you're doing, if you don't know if it's working, you could be harming, right? So it is our responsibility to figure this out. And I think it takes all of us who care about vulnerable populations to shift our framework and then do the work to make that happen. And it's a long-term commitment, right? It doesn't happen overnight.
That's very true.
So we are just about at the end of our time, so we'll take one more question and some really succinct answers, and then we'll try to wrap up. So you're there, Adam? Go for it. Alex?
Hi. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay.
Just speak to the
Sorry.
mic.
I'm Katrina Van Valkenburg with CSH, and I know Larkin Street has both transitional housing and permanent supportive housing for youth. I'd love to hear what your experience has been about what's that subset of youth who are experiencing homelessness where transitional housing may not be enough and they need permanent supportive housing. What's that subset that you've learned from your experience? And then my other question, which we may not have time for, but is also for that group who is in permanent supportive housing, how do you support them to move into more independent housing when they're ready?
So
Pick one of those questions.
Yeah, well, I can answer both of them, kind of wrap up together. Really, permanent supportive housing is not ideal for young people. It is a mechanism by which we are providing housing, but it is not ideal. There are some young people, primarily youth with, I think, more longer-term chronic homelessness histories, youth often with more pronounced mental health or substance abuse histories, or other kinds of medical or health-related issues, where longer-term, no end date on their stay in your program or in that housing is important. So that just gives more time. In order for it to be effective from a youth provider perspective, we need to be able to bake in intensive services. So we have one program that's permanent supportive housing. It is architecturally and design-wise not ideal for ensuring that young people get the services they need to be able to transition out, which at some point is going to mean that I'm running an adult program. So I think it's less about kind of certainly there needs to be permanent supportive housing for young people in the age range, but our goals ought be just that longer length of time gives us more time to effectively work with them. And then for that population that has more severe issues and would likely need supportive housing and supportive, entitlements and other kinds of support services, that they can then stay in housing, but that ought be with an adult provider.
Great. So I think in wrapping up, I think it should be clear to everybody, I doubt that this will be a surprise, that this is challenging work. And that it represents a challenge at the local level as well as at the state and federal level. But I hope folks walk away from this conversation also with the sense that this isn't a group of just do-gooders up here, right? These are really sophisticated people who have to think in really complicated ways in order to accomplish what they do on a day-to-day basis, which is to serve the most vulnerable. I also think that what folks should take away from this conversation is an understanding that while we don't have it all figured out, there are folks that are really moving every day to get closer to delivering the services that they think will make the biggest difference. And then lastly, I think you can't walk away from this conversation without being incredibly say that differently. You can't leave this conversation without hope that the work that they're doing will ultimately build the kinds of systems we think about but that we don't see today. So if we could close by simply giving these folks, Amy, as well as Paul and Sherilyn, a hand. Thanks everybody who came and who tuned in, and we'll see you all down the road. Thanks again.